I'm excited to be joined today by Dr. Joshua Greene. He is a psychologist, philosopher, and professor at Harvard University. He's also the author of Moral Tribes, Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them, which we're going to be talking about today. Josh, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Wow, thanks so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
So when we first met, you were talking about some of the new research directions your lab is going, and you said something like, I've spent the better part of 2 decades studying trolleyology. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So trolleyology is, to me, an affectionate term, maybe for some a pejorative term, for research that uses moral dilemmas that these days people now refer to as sacrificial dilemmas, and some of them involve trolleys, right? So the sort of classic examples of trolley dilemmas are what we call the switch case and the footbridge case. And the interesting thing about them, even though they've become a kind of internet meme that I think actually loses the psychological interest in a lot of ways. But from my point of view, and I think philosophers in general, the interesting thing is about the contrast between certain cases. So I mentioned the switch case. The trolley is headed towards 5 people, and you can hit a switch that will turn it away from 5 and on to 1. And there, most people say that it's okay to hit the switch, right? Save more lives. And then you've got the footbridge case where the trolley is headed towards 5 people. And this time you're on a footbridge that's spanning the tracks in between the oncoming trolley and the 5 people. And the only way you can save those 5 people, we stipulate, is that there's this person, you could say a big person or a person wearing a big backpack standing next to you, and you can save the 5 by pushing them off of the footbridge and onto the tracks, and they will get squashed by the trolley and die, but the 5 people will be saved. And there, most people say that it's wrong, although it depends actually on which country you're in and whether this is 10 years ago or 20 years ago. People have actually sort of shifted a bit on this, but certainly far fewer people say that it's okay to push the person in front of the trolley in order to save 5 people. And for me, coming in as a sort of philosopher with an interest in moral psychology and neuroscience, this was a really interesting puzzle, right? There can be some boring explanations for this, like, well, it'll work if you hit the switch, but it's not going to work if you push the guy off the footbridge. But we've done versions of this where it's more plausible that they'll both work, or if you just say, okay, assume that this will work, is it still okay or not? We still get the same answers, right? So putting those kinds of doubts aside, you see a big gap there and what's going on. And many years ago, when I was about your age or younger, actually, I had the thought that this has something to do with what triggers our emotional responses, that's what explains the difference, right? And then on the other side of this, there's cost benefit reasoning, right? So the thought is that in both of these cases, you have the thought, well, maybe it's better to save 5 lives. And in the original switch case, that's what pretty much dominates, right? That is, there isn't much to oppose that thought. And so most people say, yeah, hit the switch, get it away from the 5. And if it kills one person, not good, but better than having 5 people die. But when it comes to pushing the person off of the footbridge, the hypothesis is that there's something more emotionally salient about that action, right? With an open question about what exactly it is that triggers that emotional response. And so there's this tension in that case between the feeling that it's wrong to perform this harmful action, and the thought, yeah, but you could save more lives, right? And so this kind of was the seedling of what's now known as the dual process theory of moral judgment, which says, okay, we have 2 different channels here, one that is doing cost benefit reasoning and the other that is reacting emotionally to the particular features of the action. And we have since learned what those features are, or at least what the most important ones are. And the 2 biggies, well, 3 biggies are, one is this action is active, so you're not allowing the person to fall off of the footbridge, you are actively causing them to fall. But that's also true in the switch case, right? In the switch case, you are actively hitting the switch, right? If you do nothing, it'll just run over the 5. So that doesn't differentiate between the 2, but that's something that matters. The ones that differentiate between the 2 are what we call the use of personal force. So pushing with your hands or even pushing with a pole, right? As opposed to acting more at a distance and without a direct impact of your like muscle force. So hitting a switch, even if you say, imagine that there's a switch on the footbridge and you can hit the switch that will drop the guy through a trap door, people still think that's more okay than pushing with your hands or pushing with a pole. And then another piece of this is what's known as the mean side effect distinction, or the doctrine of double effect. That is, in the original switch case, you're harming the person as a side effect. You're turning the trolley away from the 5, and then incidentally, as a side effect, it's running over the 1. Whereas in the footbridge case, you are using this person as a trolley stopper, right? Using the person as a means. And those two things interact. So it's not just, you have these two things, but when you put them together, you get a bigger effect. And so the fact that it is active, that has this personal muscular directness, and that it's instrumental, that you're using the person as part of your plan, those things combine essentially to make this action feel violent, right? That pushing the person off the footbridge has this violent kind of feeling, whereas hitting the switch in the other case doesn't, right? And so we've got these two different channels, one reacting emotionally to the action or not, and the other adding up the costs and benefits. And then those two things get put together and you reach a kind of all things considered judgment. And so there's now been a lot of research using brain imaging, studying patients with different kinds of brain damage, using pharmacological interventions, using various behavioral tricks like putting people under cognitive load and having people do what's called veil of ignorance reasoning and things like that. And the basic story has held up, but with some interesting twists and wrinkles. And philosophically speaking, which is what got me interested in this, is I think this says something about the sort of long-standing tension in philosophy between the kind of Kantian or deontological school of thought, which thinks of certain actions as inherently right or wrong. You have certain duties that you must do, things you must do or must not do, and the utilitarian or consequentialist tradition that thinks of right and wrong primarily in terms of consequences. And I have argued that this psychological distinction is really the seed of this philosophical distinction between these two fields of thought. So there's a lot there, and there's a lot more in the book, but that's a long, short start.
How would that emerge, like from an evolutionary perspective? The more rational, slow, utilitarian type seems to make sense because it's like the benefit of the group over like long spans of time.
Yeah.
Maybe populations that base their moral values on like this type of thinking are going to outcompete the others. But then where does the emotional one kick in?
Yeah, so I view the emotional response as more typical of our social decision making. That is, for the most part, we're not guiding our social lives based on impartial cost benefit analyses. Instead, we have feelings about what's right or wrong to do, or what's appropriate to do in this context, right? And one way to think about the advantage of having that kind of emotional response is to imagine a world without it, right? Imagine a world in which people didn't have a negative feeling about the thought of pushing somebody off of a footbridge or a cliff or something like that, right? That would be a really scary, dangerous
Right,
kind
if they
of
had
world.
to pause and think about the consequences. Well, maybe if there were enough benefits from this.
Exactly. You want to live in a world where people shudder at the thought, and for the most part, the thought doesn't even occur to them, right? So having sort of basic emotional responses that make you recoil at the thought of committing acts of violence, at least under ordinary circumstances, that's a really good thing. You want to have that in there robustly in a strong emotional way, and not in a way that's going to depend on people's fragile and rationalizing sometimes and imperfect reasoning abilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, sometimes life is complicated, and sometimes you're facing situations that are new and different from what you've experienced before, and from the experiences that have sort of shaped your emotions, right? And so it's good to have the ability to think about these things in terms of costs and benefits. And so we need to have both of these kinds of thinking. And I think the emotional response is an important kind of insurance policy against wanton violent behavior. But the cost benefit thinking can be really valuable in other circumstances. And I should say that I don't think that these things are specific to morality. So my colleague, Fiery Cushman, has done a really beautiful job of trying to understand the computational underpinnings of these different kinds of thinking. And what he's argued, I think very persuasively, is that what's really going on here is that the emotional response is a product of what's called model-free learning and subsequent decision making. And the idea there is you have acquired a kind of emotionally driven habit that, you know, maybe when you were a toddler, you pushed your sister and you got punished for it or yelled at, or you saw the same thing happen to someone else, and you developed a negative feeling about those kinds of actions, right? And there, you're not thinking about the consequences. You don't have a model of the situation that says, oh, I shouldn't do this because if I do this, this will happen, and then that will happen, and then that will happen, and then that would be bad, right? Instead, it's just, oof, don't do that, right? Whereas model-based reasoning is essentially reasoning with a theory or a story or a model about which actions are likely to lead to which consequences, and then the ultimate value of the actions is determined by their causal relationships to the consequences, right? Which is exactly what we think we're doing when we think, you know, 5 lives versus 1, right? And the key thing here is that this is not specific to morality. This is a very general distinction, and you can see this in, you know, rodents navigating a maze. You know, they can learn the maze in a kind of habitual way where they sort of learn, you know, okay, at this point I feel like I should turn right, at this point I feel like I should turn left. But they can also develop a map, and the way you can tell that they develop a map is if you change the route, you know, you block a familiar route, they can quickly find another one based on their understanding of the story. So humans do the same thing. So I think this is sort of very general, basic human learning and decision-making abilities where we're either attaching feelings directly to actions or evaluating actions based on our understanding of their likely consequences.
We have plenty of fast, automatic, unconscious cognitive processes that you wouldn't necessarily consider emotional gut reactions. Like if you just look at some words, you'll probably read it automatically without even realizing you're reading.
Yeah.
But then contrast that to what you're talking about here. Is that because there's some sort of like reward learning that's going on where you associate it with reward or punishment, and then that's what brings it into like the emotional realm?
I'd say as a first pass, yeah, that for the most part, the way we attach values to actions is based on some kind of past experience. So it could be your own past experience. You touch the hot stove and you learn not to do that, right? But it can also be through culturally transmitted or socially transmitted learning. You watch somebody touch the stove and go, ah, right? And then you go, okay, note to self, don't do that kind of thing, right? And then there's learning over evolutionary time, right? Where you know, creatures might naturally have a fear of their, you know, natural predators without having any experience themselves and without having ever been taught, right? So yeah, I think it's when there's some kind of experience saying this has gone badly before, either for yourself or other people you're indirectly or directly interacting with, or at the species level, that's when you're in this kind of domain of emotional responding. It's an interesting question as an aside. What is going on with the visual system, right? That is, you know, increasingly, you know, vision sciences has been completely transformed in the last 5 or so years by deep learning, and that these are the leading models of how vision works. But deep learning models are trained with a kind of feedback, whether it's deep reinforcement learning, in which case it's reinforcement learning, or deep learning just trained by you know, some version of backprop gradient descent. There are reward signals saying, yeah, do more of that. That's how you see better, right? And presumably, you know, something like that is happening in the development of the visual system. So this actually kind of brings your question back in a different way. You say, okay, so things like, you know, don't push the person off the footbridge, that is an emotional kind of thing. Why is vision not? If your visual system has been trained by some kind of reward-based feedback, And I think that's an interesting question. It's clearly a different mechanism, but exactly why and how different it is, I don't think we completely know.
Another thing that to drag us into the philosophical weeds would be if this is true, if our moral intuitions are grounded on basically learning, whether throughout our evolutionary past or just through your own upbringing as a child, you could imagine a hypothetical where someone had like anti-learning for everything. So reward in all the cases where you'd normally be punished, and punishment in
Yeah.
all the cases where you'd normally be rewarded. And
Yeah.
I'm guessing like the deontological folks who believe that there are these objective moral truths would say that that's just wrong. Maybe it wouldn't work. But then if you're viewing people more like a blank slate, I guess, then you could imagine someone who could develop or learn like these inverse morals.
Right. I mean, and depending on your perspective, you see some versions of this cross-culturally, whether it's, across cultures today, or in or looking back in time in, in a culture that's more familiar, right? So there are some cultures in which, you know, um, it would be morally wrong not to, give your child a good beating, if they perform some kind of act that today we would say, we really shouldn't do that, and here's why, and please apologize, right? There are, so we can see, at least from our own cultural perspectives, other cultures, or maybe even aspects of our own cultures, where we think the wrong thing is being reinforced, but to the people who've experienced that reinforcement, it feels like the right thing, right?
So that sounds somewhat close to moral relativism because on one hand you have like the parts that vary across culture, and I guess people might argue you can't say one culture's moral values are better than another. But then on the other hand, you have perhaps some more fundamental values that are shared across all humans
Yeah.
everywhere. Do we have any good evidence for that?
Well, so this is one of the central questions in moral tribes and in moral philosophy, and specifically in the subfield known as metaethics, which is really about the metaphysical status of ethics. And I I wrote a dissertation a while ago in philosophy arguing that ultimately there's not truly any fact of the matter about what's right or what's wrong, in the same way that there are other kinds of real facty facts. Like, if the sun is larger than the earth, that is just true. And if it looks to you like the earth is bigger, that's just because you've got a misleading perspective, right? And if someone from some other planet says that the earth is bigger than the sun, say they're wrong. Sorry, right? At least, if our understanding of this is correct. I don't think that morality is like that. However, I've changed my mind over the years about how much that really matters. I think that what really matters is whether or not we have some reasonable basis for agreement, right? Um, and and, and so then my attention, as I was working through different stages of the book, shifted to that question of what could be the basis for our agreement. And my view is that there may not be some ultimate facty fact about what's right or what's wrong, but I think very few of us are content to just say, well, then to hell with everything, anything goes, do whatever you want, right? So then the question is, we have these values that we're committed to, and there's some overlap in our values across tribes, but there's obviously a lot of difference in our values across tribes, and those are the things that get the most attention, and those are the things that we're fighting about, right? So how could we resolve those disagreements? And my view is that a much maligned and much misunderstood philosophy known as utilitarianism is our best answer to that question. And I think it's best understood not as morality, but as metamorality. That is a basic moral system with basic moral rules like don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't punch people in the face or kill them. That's morality. And that the fundamental design there is, how do you get a bunch of otherwise selfish creatures to get along and cooperate and survive better together, right? And you need to have rules and corresponding emotional systems that prevent people from harming each other right? Except in rare circumstances, and that motivate people to be nice to each other and to be cooperative and to work together. And when I have food and you don't, I share, and the reverse when you do, right? And that's a tribe like that can survive better, right? But when you have tribes with different values, you can't rely on those tribal intuitions about what's right or what's wrong to have people get along. So what does it look like to kind of step outside of your local tribal morality and the feelings that guide it? And I think that the one of the key insights of the utilitarian perspective is that behind most, if not all, of our values is something about the quality of people's experience, right? So if you ask, say, Adam, why did you go to work today? And you say, well, I enjoy my work, but also, need to pay the bills. I'm like, well, why do you need to pay the bills? It's like, well, I got to pay rent. We're like, well, why do you need to have a apartment to live in? It's like, well, it's cold outside. And I say, well, what's wrong with being cold? Well, it's painful. Well, what's wrong with pain? Well, it's just bad, right? At some point, you kind of run out of answers, right? And if you start with any value and say, well, why do you care about that? Why do you care about that? Why do you care about that? It's almost always going to come down to the quality of someone's experience. You could call it pleasure or pain, but I think maybe more broadly call it sort of positive or negative experience, right? And so the idea here then is to say, okay, so that's kind of the value behind our values. And if we all want to get along with each other across tribes, it makes sense to say that everybody's well-being matters equally, right? And if you put those two things together, well-being is ultimately about the quality of people's conscious experiences. That at least has some cross-tribal purchase. And you say, and everybody's experience is equally valuable, right? Then you have the beginnings of a metamorality, of a moral standard that can allow us to resolve differences between tribes. So this tribe says, if a woman is unfaithful to her husband, she should be killed. Honor killing's great, right? And another culture says, no, that's not how things should be. How do you resolve that? Well, one way to resolve it is to say, well, which set of rules makes things overall go better, right? And you say, well, what do you mean by go better? They, well, go better in the sense that people, there's more happiness and less suffering overall, right? And that way, using this common currency of the quality of experience, you can say, okay, maybe some ways of doing things are better than others. Now, you can still question that standard. You can still say, but okay, but why should, maybe there should be other things that matter other than the quality of people's experience. And I don't think there's a knockdown argument against that. But the argument that I make in Moral Tribes is this is our best common currency. This is our best hope of having a standard that is not, it's not like anyone's first moral language, but it's a kind of second moral language. It's a standard that's accessible and that can at least partially make sense to everybody. And so back to this question of moral relativism, what I would say is maybe ultimately there's no fact of the matter about what's right or what's wrong. If there's some clever alien who's just going to reject any moral premise that you have, you may not be able to win that argument, right? But here on Earth, with humans, with partly overlapping, partly diverging values, maybe there is a kind of standard that we could agree on if at least when we need to try to resolve our disagreements. And so that's, I argue for this, and I don't like utilitarianism as a term because I think it gives people the wrong idea like 10 different ways. And recently there were events that confirmed that people can really be very wrong about what utilitarianism would have you do and how to live your life. I prefer to call it deep pragmatism. That is, it's ultimately about producing good consequences, but we need to be pragmatic, not only in the sense of trying to make things go better, but in the sense of taking the strengths and limitations of human nature seriously, recognizing the value, for example, of having feelings that make us not want to push people off of footbridges. That's a really good thing, and we don't want to lose sight of that. So I'll leave it at that for now, but that's I think a kind of middle ground between a sort of nihilistic relativism, anything goes, and needing to believe that there's some fully objective moral truth.
Do you think this pragmatism is different from believing that there is some truth out there, but it's just so complicated, there are so many millions of variables that you could never take into account, that's what like when you get these sort of broad kind of moral heuristics that what they're really doing is saying, even if the truth is out there, it's too complicated to ever get, but this gives us our best bet. So it's practically the same, but I guess like the metaphysical assumptions are different.
I think that's right. I think that you could be a deep pragmatist and be agnostic about moral truth, or firmly believe that there is no moral truth, and in practice it would be the same. I think what you can't do is think that you know the moral truth, and the moral truth happens to be what corresponds to you and your tribe's moral intuitions.
Mm-hmm. So how does theory of mind come into that? Because I'm sure you're familiar with Jason Mitchell's work here. I did a recent podcast with him, and we didn't get to connect it to moral psychology at all, but I imagine there's some connection there where it's like we have this this sort of automatic tendency to think, well, I want what's best for me, but then also it seems like if you train people to think, oh, well, what if you were born in different circumstances? You could imagine yourself in someone else's shoes, and to the extent you do that, you get these more like broadly humanist moral values.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of points of connection here, right? I mean, one is, I've said every on the deep pragmatist perspective, everybody's well-being matters equally. That's kind of a fully morally impartial point of view where you and the people you care about most don't count any more than strangers, at least if you're trying to be fair, right? But what would even motivate a human to care about anyone other than themselves, right? I mean, why are we not like sharks, right? Or why are all of us not like complete psychopaths, right? Where we just, the idea of just chopping someone up to bits feels no different from, hacking apart an old piece of furniture, right? Where does that come from, right? Well, one possibility is, and it's plausible, at least in the case of, parents and offspring, or mothers and offspring, that there's just an innate emotional connection there, right? Just a direct kind of caring. Another possibility, and that maybe this applies more to not direct kin or offspring, is we can have a kind of empathy or compassion and understand what other people are thinking and feeling, and have that directly motivate us, so that if we know someone's suffering, we tend to want to alleviate that suffering. And just a basic regard for other people's experience, right? I mean, that's kind of a premise in the argument, right? That if you just don't get it, it's not like you can necessarily give somebody an argument for why they should. I'm reminded of the old Monty Python sketch where I think, John Cleese is playing this sort of caricature of a businessman who's approached by someone for, I don't remember, it was a beggar or someone for charity. And he's like, wait a second. Okay, so I give you the money, but then what do I get? And they're like, no, you just give it to me. You're like, well, why would I want to do that? That doesn't seem like a very good deal, right? And the sketch just goes on where he's just trying to get his head around this idea of like, wait, I just give to you and that's it, right? Why are we all not like that? I think there's something deep in there related to theory of mind, related to our capacity for empathy and compassion, and it's probably different things layered on top of each other. You're probably in a better position to answer this than I am.
On the other side, you would imagine, like from an evolutionary or genetic perspective, you would have this ingrained bias where like my life is the most valuable, but I would sacrifice it for 2 brothers or 8 cousins.
Yes, exactly. And famous JBS Haldane. Yeah.
Right. So how widespread or recent is this shared value of like all human lives should be valued equally?
I think it's a pretty new idea. I mean, there are hints of it in other places. So there is an ancient Chinese philosopher, it's spelled Mozi or Mozu. I'm sure I'm getting it wrong, but people who know will know which philosopher I'm talking about, who was a kind of early consequentialist or utilitarian, who argued that the society should be organized around promoting the greatest amount of well-being for all. Now, I'm not enough of a scholar of this philosophy to know, okay, but did he really mean that for all humans, like anyone outside of the tribe, or is he just talking about within the relevant society? I'm not sure what the answer is there. But this is the earliest closest thing to a kind of utilitarian consequentialist philosophy, and this was, I think, close to 2000 years ago. And then, as far as I know, we don't get anything like that again until the Western tradition and the philosophies kind of leading up to utilitarianism and reaching their kind of canonical forms in the work of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. But yeah, so it's not something natural. I think it has to kind of be constructed by a philosophical mind.
What do you think of the claims that these humanist values are grounded in religious values?
It depends on what you mean by grounded, right?
So I'm not saying in the sense of like they're preordained by some creator and that's the reason we have them. More so like from a historical perspective, these philosophies like built on well, in the West at least, it might be Christian foundations. But
yeah, so it's interesting. So there's a interesting sort of nexus of work, partly coming from Joe Henrich and I think Jonathan Schultz, and partly from Ara Norenzayan. And there are sort of different pieces of this. So Ara Norenzayan, and this is beautifully sort of described in his book, Big Gods, argues that there's a kind of progression where you get the sort of expanding circle, to use Peter Singer's terminology, with religion, that, early religions were more about kind of explaining all the weird stuff around us. Why does the sun go around and then the moon follows it and things like that? And to the extent that there was anything metaphysical, it was often ancestors and ancestor worship and the belief in different kinds of spirits who were not necessarily good, like the ancient Greek gods, where they're not models of virtue. A lot of them they're just bad people who just happen to be very powerful and can, do crazy stuff, right? And then the rise of sort of big religions, with the key innovation was that you had a all-knowing, omniscient God who cares about how people treat each other, right? And so it's kind of the perfect guarantor of moral behavior. If you do something that's bad for other people, God is going to know about it. God is going to care about it. God is going to do something about it, right? And that is really central to Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and the idea then is that you could have larger societies and cooperation on a larger scale if you have a big group of people that are too big for the people to know each other personally, but they are all connected to the same set of ideas of this big God that's watching over everybody and making everybody be pro-social, at least to the people within the religion, right?
You could say it's like a personification of the collective watchful eye.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, across a lot of these religions, you see the eye motif. So you see this in Christianity. You see this in ancient Mesoamerican religions. You see this in what am I thinking?
Egypt.
Anyway, it's a lot. Sorry, what'd you say?
Egypt.
Yeah, exactly right. The Eye of Horus. Yes, exactly. Right. And that eye is a very common sort of recurring theme of, the big person is watching you even when it looks like no one's around. Right. So, Norenzayan argues that this enabled prosociality to scale up. And then you have modern secular states combining religious tribes. So here in a place like the United States and countries in Europe and elsewhere, you've got people who from different religious traditions all living together, and what's guaranteeing that people are at least relatively nice to each other is a secular system of courts and prisons and so on, which have their limitations and their problems, but it's not anarchy, right? An interesting question is, how did that transition work? And this is where Joe Henrich's work comes in, and in particular his work on the origins of weirdness, right? So in 2010, Norenzayan and Henrich and others published this paper on weirdness, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people, which are the sort of strange outliers culturally, but it's the culture that I grew up in, and perhaps you too, and And this became a big thing in research because it's like, okay, we should be studying people who are not weird. But after that, Henrik wanted to say, well, okay, but where did weirdness come from? And in his book, The Weirdest People in the World, and in some research papers, he and his collaborators have argued this actually had its origins kind of accidentally in a religious process. So the Western Church, consciously or unconsciously, wanted to consolidate its power, and its main competition was the network of kin and clans that people had their allegiance to at a more lower level. So the church outlawed cousin marriage, going all the way out to, fifth cousins or sixth cousins, right? And the idea then is that people couldn't be breeding and living in these clan networks. Instead, they had to go out and interbreed with people and intermarry with people from other clans. And so this broke up the dominant social structure that was in competition with the church. And now it's just these more atomized families and individuals, nuclear families that live away from their parents and things like that, right? I mean, that we think of that as fairly normal in the United States, but this is weird, historically. So that whole set of things about, small families living on their own, and then people, living with and trading with sort of free markets with or relatively free markets with strangers, depending on other strangers as opposed to family and kin for, what you're selling and what you're buying. That more individualistic and more market-oriented society was inadvertently created by the church to consolidate its power over the pre-existing clan network. But then what happened was that more atomized, individualistic, market-based society kind of became more and more successful economically and technologically, and at least in Europe, to a large extent, overtook the power of the church. So now the secular state, with its free markets and impersonal laws governing the lives of people who are living primarily as individuals in small nuclear families, that is now the dominant social structure and power structure. So that's, I think, a fascinating story, and I think the evidence supports it. So that's my best understanding of how we got to be this way, at least in the Weird West.
Would you say that as the tribe gets larger, so too does the animosity between tribes? So like on a very proximal level, let's say you have sports team rivalry where there's a certain level of tension, but in the end, you're all fellow countrymen. And then you have like nationalism where it gets more intense. And then maybe you have weirdness or you have religion, which bands together multiple countries. But then as you move up the hierarchy, it seems like the intensity of the conflict gets bigger. And then maybe at the pinnacle of that, if there was ever some like alien Independence Day war, like all of humanity would bind together stronger than you've ever seen. But then the rivalry between humans and the aliens might be stronger than any human rivalry you've ever seen.
Yeah. I'm not sure that rivalries at the, say, national level are really more acrimonious and sort of psychologically intense than lower level ones. I mean, if you ask people, who do you dislike most in the world, I think people are more likely to say some person who done them wrong or someone, who they cared about, right? I mean, like that's more actually dominant in people's lives than like, whatever negative feelings they might have for people in some country on the other side of the world. I think that what makes our situation in the modern world so precarious is our technology, right? So, if jilted lovers and street gangs had nuclear weapons, we'd be in even more trouble than we're already in, right? But the thing is, when you have nations with enormous resources to organize and marshal, then you can get things like nuclear weapons and biological weapons, or just regular old incredibly damaging conventional weapons of the kind that are currently being used in Ukraine, right? That I think is the biggest. I think that's what makes the conflicts bigger, is that the size of the tribes allows for a kind of technological leverage that you don't get in most, more small scale human conflicts, and that we don't see historically. So it's not that we're nastier. We're today, I don't think we're nastier than we were in the past. If anything, I think we're less nasty, following the arguments made by Steven Pinker in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. But at the same time, we're at greater risk of wiping ourselves out, because all it would take is one nuclear war or engineered pandemic, and poof, we could all be gone, or knocked back, hundreds of years in terms of the progress of our civilization.
But at the smaller scale, there's this old Arabic saying, which is me against my brother and I against my cousin and I against the stranger. So
Yeah.
there's on one hand the animosity, but on the other hand, this idea of like when push comes to shove, this closer group is kind of banded together against the even larger group. So that's
right. And then the question is, and this is bringing us back to deep pragmatism and meta morality, is can we buck that cycle? Do we always have to be fighting at the highest level, right? And this is, I think, what the evolutionary process does. Anything that evolves because it provides a competitive advantage. That's how evolution works, whether it's biological evolution or cultural evolution, right? I mean, if I have 5 fingers and that's very useful, it's because the creatures that didn't have 5 fingers died, right? Not all at once, but over time didn't survive as well, right? And so it's the currency of evolution is always death, right? And it's always for the purpose of competition. And to me, I think the big question for our species is, can we climb that evolutionary ladder and kick it away? Can we find a way to all cooperate and to all just be one happy species, and maybe bring other species into and not cause them great pain the way that we do in factory farms and things like that? Can we have a universal morality that regards all suffering as bad and all happiness as good for everybody, as opposed to only banding together for the purposes of fighting some other group? And
you would imagine that something like that exists at the top of the evolutionary ladder, and like maybe we're converging towards it over time, but people don't seem to like that idea.
Well, I actually think people like the idea, but we don't seem to necessarily be. I mean, I think we are getting closer to that, but we're not quite there, right? I mean, there is not an evolutionary pressure to do this. So my favorite analogy for this is, think about birth control, right? This is going to sound like this has nothing to do with this, but I promise it'll come back, right? So, if we can sort of dramatize your genes, right? There's nothing that your genes want less than for you to use birth control, right? I mean, birth control is the absolute worst thing. Your genes want more copies of themselves spread, and things like, birth control pills and condoms are stopping your genes from spreading when you use them, right? But we humans have said, we have these impulses that make us want to do things that will lead to more babies. Well, we enjoy having sex, and we maybe don't want to have children or have as many children as we otherwise could, or as our food stocks, et cetera, would support. So we say, okay, I'm going to have no children. I'm going to have 1 or 2 or 3 children, but I'm not going to have as many as I'm biologically and economically capable of having, and I'm going to use birth control. And this is essentially, where these primates that are using our general purpose problem solving abilities to outsmart the processes that were designed to help us spread our genes, right? Evolution gave us impulses that make us want to reproduce, and it gave us general reasoning capacities that help us solve problems in general. And then we've kind of turned evolution on its head and said, okay, well, we're going to use our general problem solving abilities to enjoy the benefits of sex, but not have to have 20 children or whatever it is, right? And so this is an example of us transcending the sort of the evolutionary commandments and saying, okay, well, evolution has its own values in some sense, but these are our values and this is what we want, and we're going to use our big fat brains to do something else. And my hope is that a better understanding of morality and our own psychology can lead people to say, look, we have enough good stuff for everybody. We don't really have to fight, right? So why don't we figure out how to get along and live in such a way that everybody can have enough to be happy, and maybe super happy, right? And I think we've made progress along those lines. But then there are always people who want to enhance their own status by saying, you see those other people over there, they hate you. They view you as the enemy, right? And they're going to attack you unless you come with me and we have our own little tribal thing, right? And what's really going on there is that kind of authoritarian leader is advancing his own status within the tribe at the expense of intertribal well-being, right?
Right.
And so we need to get better at seeing through that ruse and figuring out how we can be one tribe, not culturally homogeneous, but enough of one tribe that we are not that we're not fundamentally fighting with each other.
This is the perfect place to transition. So once you have that noble goal established, even if people are trying to do good, they're not always good at it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
So this is where we get into this idea of effective altruism and your recent work with the giving multiplier. And
Yeah. So I think I'll tell you about sort of two lines of research that are related here, right? So, we as individuals have resources. At least a lot of us are fortunate enough to have money that we can spend either on ourselves or on other people. And a lot of us, if we're going to give to charity, will give to a charity that kind of has a personal connection to us. They might say, you love animals, so I want to support the local animal shelter, or I live here in Boston, or in the Boston area, so I want to support the local schools or the local food bank, right? But if what you're really, instead you could think, well, I want to just be impartial. I want to help. I want to do as much good as I can. And for people like us, here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the most good we can do is probably not going to be here, because you can provide a child with a deworming treatment that will rid the child, at least temporarily, of debilitating parasitic worms for under $1, right? So for $100 gift, you can do that 100 times. And that just goes a lot farther than anything you can do in the United States, right? So, it's possible to give your money wisely in a way that has a huge impact. But at the
there's
same
something unsexy about it. It's like,
yes,
I volunteered at a deworming facility versus like I helped at a animal shelter.
yeah, not even volunteer, just wrote a check, or clicked a button and got a bill and a charge on your credit card, right? So yeah, so that's the point. The point I'm going to make is that the most impactful things we can do are not necessarily the most personally meaningful or emotionally satisfying. Now, one response to that is to say, well, tell your feelings to shut up and just do the thing that does the most good. And as a psychologist, I tried more or less making that argument to people, and some people get it, but most people go, no, right? And then Lucius Caviola, who's in my lab, or was until recently, and I hit on this idea of, well, instead of doing this thing that you really like, do this other thing that has bigger benefits. If you say to people, look, why don't we meet halfway? Give some to the local animal shelter, but also give some to the deworming charity. And it turned out in experiments we did that people really liked that. And then we thought, okay, that's interesting. And what we found was that if you give people a choice where you say, okay, you can give all here to the one, to the local animal shelter, let's say, or all to the deworming, almost everybody picks their own favorite charity. But if you say, okay, you could do A or B or a 50-50 split, we find that more money goes to the super effective charity if you offer people a split option than if you just say you have to choose one or the other. That was interesting. And then we thought, okay, but how would we motivate people to do this? You can't just say to the world, hey, make split donations. Like, people just won't do that. We said, well, what if we incentivize people and we could advertise that? And we found that if you said, hey, we'll add extra money on top of both of your donations if you split it, people really like that, which is not surprising because people like having money added to their donations, you'd think. And then we thought, okay, but where's that money going to come from? And we tried asking people, hey, you just got this money added on top. Would you take some of the money that you were going to give, especially to the charity that you just learned about, and put it into a matching fund so that other people, so that other people can get the same kind of benefit that you got? Not everybody, but a fair number of people said, okay, I'll do that. And so, and it looked like enough people would support the matching fund to cover the costs of the people who didn't, right? So we thought, this could be like a self-sustaining thing where we incentivize people to give partly to charities they already love, but partly to super effective charities. And we add money on top, and then we ask people to help us with the adding money on top. and it could all work. So Lucius and friends, a web developer named Fabio Kuhn, built this website called Giving Multiplier that does exactly this. So you you go to the site, you find your favorite charity as long as it's registered in the US, and then you pick a charity from our list of super effective charities. And these are things like distributing malaria nets and deworming, which I mentioned, incentivizing mothers to get their children vaccinated. We have one charity that's related to climate change, but specifically finding long-term sustainable energy solutions. A charity that's devoted to preventing the next pandemic. And animal charities that are not just about taking care of a small number of animals in a shelter, but changing the horrible practices in factory farms or finding non-animal substitutes for meat that people like. So the kinds of things that can really have a huge impact. So you pick one of those, and then you say, how much do you want to give overall? And then you decide how you want to allocate between the two charities with a little slider. And the more you give to the super effective charity, the more money Giving Multiplier adds on top. So right now, if you do a 50-50 split, Giving Multiplier will add 50% onto both of your donations. And then you'll have the opportunity to support the matching fund if you make a donation. So we have been doing this now. We launched this almost 2 years ago, and we have raised close to $2 million with this, and over $1 million has gone to super duper effective charities. Many lives have been saved, and lots of good research on things like sustainable energy has been supported. And we're doing that again this year. And I knew I was going to be on, so we created a code for your listeners. So the code is NATURENURTURE. And if you go to givingmultiplier.org/NatureNurture, you'll get an extra, you'll get up to 50%. The base rate is a 45% match for a 50-50 split. You get the 50% match that I mentioned. And if you give everything to a super effective charity, we'll give you a dollar for dollar match with that code. So that's a plug for Giving Multiplier for your listeners. Tell your friends and family about it. They can all use the code. But back to the science, the idea here is it's a kind of dual process thing. We're trying to acknowledge people's emotional commitments and the way people actually think and what motivates people to be altruistic in the first place, but then kind of, urging people and incentivizing people to do something that's more impactful than what they might otherwise be inclined to do. And I don't say this as a kind of outsider who's immune to this. My wife and I, we support, with our end of the year donations, we support super effective charities of the kind that we support on Giving Multiplier, but we also give to our local schools, and we give to other local causes and causes that are close to our heart. So this is the same kind of thing that we do. So this is a way, I think, of using our understanding of people's psychology when it comes to altruism, including my own psychology, and thinking, okay, how do we make a bridge between how we naturally feel and what can actually do the most good for the world?
That's wonderful. That's a great place to close.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Josh.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. This is great. Yeah, delighted to share these ideas and hear your thoughts about it.
Glad to hear them.